Yeah. Okay, cool. Wonderful. Thank you so much for this. I am just like so excited to be here, y'all. I really, really am. I was looking forward to this for the past like 2 weeks or something like that. So I'm just really, really excited for this. And I know we have a limited time too, so I'm not going to belabor this too much, but deeply excited, deeply appreciative for y'all being here, all the things that you had to put on hold or all the things that you're not doing right now in order to be here. I appreciate that deeply. So I'm not going to waste too much time, but just to give you all a kind of overview of what tonight's going to look like, at least on my end, I'm going to talk, and I don't have any slides or anything like that. I'm very much an academic, and I use the written word and the page and all that to do the things that I do. So I hope that's okay. I hope this is enjoyable enough and interesting enough, and I hope I am enjoyable and interesting enough for you all. So I'm going to speak for maybe half the time. We have like 45 minutes or so. I'm going to speak for almost exactly half that time. And then once I'm finished with that, then I'm going to ask us to do like a small activity that I'm going to give you all maybe 10 minutes to do. And then after that, the remainder of the time will be sharing that activity, what we talked about or what we wrote for that activity, and then also thinking about questions that you might have about the activity, about what I've shared, et cetera, et cetera. But this is not going to be the only time you can ask questions. Absolutely feel free to email me and we can set up a time to chat, or we can chat via email. Any kind of lingering questions or things you want to talk about, I am thoroughly happy to do all of that. So the Black Anarchism talk, kind of intro to Black Anarchism 101. So what I'm going to do in my remarks, I'm going to first talk about what anarchism is, the kind of common worries or reservations that people have of anarchism, different kinds of anarchists and anarchisms, and then I'll move specifically into Black anarchism, and then also how gender circulates through all of that. And then finally, I'm going to try to close with what a world might look like via Black anarchism, which will then bleed into our activity. All right, so here we go. And I have notes here in front of me as well, just to make sure I'm not going too far off script because we are kind of in a compressed time. So what is anarchism? So anarchism often gets a super bad rap because it's oftentimes implied or signifies kind of deeply undesirable state of affairs. So things developed or devolved into pure anarchism, they say. But why is that word connoted so negatively? That's actually the question when I first started to learn about anarchism. That's the question I came to. Like, if I'm reading all these things and it sounds pretty cool, why does this negative connotation persist? And I think the negative connotation kind of presumes that the current state of affairs is desirable and in need of no change, which then makes deviation from that state of affairs, which is to say something like anarchism, which makes that bad. But if radical leftists and anarchists, and generally people who are committed to liberatory politics, which I hope is most or all of us, if we assert that the current state of affairs, so the status quo, the mainstream, what is, what exists, how things are structured right now, if we assume that those things are not what we want, then deviation from that is then positively connoted. And that's how we want to try to, or at least how I want to try to shift the connotation of anarchism. And then anarchists understand anarchism as this political, interpersonal, and might even say societal mode of existing in the world with other people. So, for example, people like Gandhi or Tolstoy might be considered anarchists, not to mention the kind of classical anarchists in name like Peter Kropotkin or Pierre Joseph Proudhon or Bakunin, Emma Goldman, et cetera, et cetera. And even though the people are quite different in a lot of ways, the foundation or the thread that kind of runs through all these folks is that anarchism is an ethical and methodological and intentional way of existing in relation to others and the world. So the moment then when anarchism began to gain prominence as an identifiable organizational position was, at least historically, in response to theocracies of the 18th century, generally in the West, but also in other places in the world. And anarchism was a kind of alternative to these, what were understood to be oppressive and disciplinary governmental and societally controlling theocracy. So it's defined, and I have a quote here by scholar Nathan Junn, who writes in this article, Rethinking the Anarchist Canon. that anarchism is an unqualified moral opposition to relationships and institutions based on coercion, domination, oppression, and other forms of arbitrary and unjustifiable authority. An active moral commitment to abolishing such relationships and institutions. So, this, in a nutshell, is anarchism. This opposition to, or even subversion of these unconscionable domination and oppressive positions. And this is kind of the thread through all the different iterations of anarchism. So you have a whole bunch of subsets and sects of anarchism. So syndicalists, individualists, anarcho-feminists, which I'll talk about in a moment, libertarian and socialists, all these kinds of different strands of anarchism, they have base and fundamentally have this strain of wanting to abolish these oppressive, dominating norms of society. Excuse me. So then we have these I would say three key foundational anarchist concepts. And those things are anti-statism, anti-authoritarianism, and direct participation. Those are the kind of three foundational tenets of anarchism. So I'm going to go through each of them. So anti-statism is simply, or maybe not so simply, the rejection of all the coercive, hierarchical, kind of circumscribing logics that are embedded in the notion of the state. And I think it's also important to make clear that the state is both this conglomeration of institutions and officials, bureaucrats, laws, structures, and regulations, but it's not innocent or simply there. I think so often it's assumed that these things that are in place are simply there, are simply the way things are. Nevertheless, they are deeply, deeply constructed. They're a constructed series of regulations. But not only is the state that, it's also importantly, very important to note that the state should not simply be understood as this centralized top-down institution, which it also is, but it's also a kind of relation. It's a way of relating to others in certain kinds of ways, certain kinds of regulative ways. So the state is both this top-down centralized thing, but also a massive web of relations. So that's anti-statism. Anti-authoritarianism is what is captured in the very, very popular and pretty characteristic anarchist phrase, no gods, no masters. So this is meant to imply not, I want to make this clear too, it's meant not to imply a kind of disdain for religious belief necessarily. There are many people who are avowed anarchists who understand themselves as religiously inclined. There's a whole bunch of folks who understand themselves in that way. But instead, the phrase "no gods, no masters" is a kind of assertion of a refusal of this kind of top-down hierarchical subordination. So to say "no gods, no masters" is to undermine the validity of this assumptive naturalness in a kind of select few people being above or in control of other people. So anti-authoritarianism tries to argue that no one should be the decider or controller of another's fate. And that then leads us to direct participation, which asserts that that those for whom a certain rule or ethic is applicable ought to have a say in the formulation of those rules and ethics. So if one is to be accountable to certain communal mandates, then it stands that one should be able to participate directly. And that's, I think, the key part of this, directly, in how those mandates are decided upon. So rather than kind of offsetting your volition to someone else who then acts as a representative of you, direct participation, or at least anarchism understanding of direct participation, wants us to understand that we are to be directly participatory in the things that matter to and impact us. So that's anarchism, kind of the bare bones definition of anarchism. Then also, I want to talk about the ways that I was going to say sometimes, but I think oftentimes, honestly, there are these kind of misconceptions of anarchism, specifically as it relates to kind of what about crime and violence, and then also, on the other hand, that anarchism and the kind of utopic world that it imagines is unrealistic. So I want to try to speak to those two things and then delve specifically into Black anarchism. When it comes to violence, and I think this point is really, really necessary to get across, and that is sometimes difficult for some folks that I've talked to, at least for them to understand, the primary doer of violence is the state and its various legal, institutional, sanctioned entities and traditions. So, namely, capitalism and all the things that capitalism entails, the military, colonialism and imperial conquest, environmental extraction and exploitation, privatized property, not to mention the criminal punishment system. All of these things are the primary doers of violence, not this person who hits this person or shoots this other person on the street. The primary doer of the vast majority of violence in this world is what we might call the state, because of all these different facets. So as an institutional edifice, and again, remember that the state is both this institutional edifice, but also a relation. But as an institutional edifice, the state is kind of generated out of and through, it validates itself and kind of manifests itself through the violence of various kinds of things. So things like bestowing poverty, which leads to kind of premature death in a whole bunch of ways, or the kind of the state-sanctioned death that abolitionists like Saidiya Hartman or Ruth Wilson Gilmore have noted. And the state kind of generates this violence out of privatizing property and land, which has generated a massive unhoused population, and exploitative lending and renting and buying practices, which my former colleague Kianga Yamada Taylor outlines brilliantly in her book Race for Profit. Highly recommend that if y'all have not read that. But also by literally having prisons, imprisoning people, carcerality, all these things are modes of violence that the state generates. This is the kind of violence, which might be violence as such, we might even say. This is the kind of violence that goes deeply overlooked or is thought as non-existent really in critiques of anarchism being or not having a plan for violence. And I'm actually reminded of, I've used this example a number of times over the past 3, 4, 5 years, or something like that. Just like thinking about the ways that the state's violence is rendered invisible. So there was this very, very telling news headline years ago that read something like, "Violence breaks out at a university after vigil for student killed by police." So if we take that sentence, the violence occurs after the literal murder of a person. So the police committed no violence in the logic of this sentence. It's only when the representatives of the state are damaged or critiqued or interrogated that quote unquote violence happens. So what qualifies as violence is not the thing that caused the vigil to happen in the first place, someone literally being killed, the state sanctioned police murder, but the response to that violence. So this is the way that violence is obscured by the state, that the violence of the state is obscured, and only certain kinds of things are thought of as violent. So that's why I want us to really, really think about, how are we understanding violence? Where are we locating violence? What does violence look like? And then the accusation, I would say, that that anarchism is unrealistic. So there's this very, I think, prominent critique, if it can even be called a critique, that radical ways of thinking and living and relating, like anarchism, like abolition, are unrealistic and utopian. These things are deemed as negatively connoted. And then they conclude from that, the conclusion from that is that we should do and think something else that would be more doable or more plausible. And then in the context of anarchism, there's a way that existing frameworks are made to seem natural and unable to be changed. And anarchism then being a kind of crime against nature and an effort to kind of fuel effort, which to me rings incredibly false. And I think, in fact, disregards the numerous historical societal configurations that were deemed natural. Thinking, for example, of antebellum enslavement in the US and how that was understood as a natural station for certain kinds of people. This critique, I think, also seems to stop any momentum toward liberatory and radical politics and world making before it can even begin. I think, in fact, the assertion that anarchism and other kinds of radical politics are unrealistic is, in fact, a function of the state to protect and preserve itself from not being critiqued or interrogated. So ultimately, what I think when anarchism is being accused of being unrealistic is something I've learned from the gender studies theorist Judith Butler, who is actually a little bit skeptical of anarchism, but we can bracket that out for now. But what Butler said is that when they're kind of met with these accusations of the unrealistic nature of advocating for nonviolence or non-disposability or non-punitivity, which I'll talk about more as constitutive of Black anarchism, uh, Butler asks the question of whether one wants to live in a world in which no one ever asks the question of how to foundation our world and relationship to others based on radical nonviolence or non-punitivity. So how can we even conceptualize the possibility of this kind of world without asking the question and in fact working toward its actualization, even if it might ultimately fail. So the pursuit of non-punitivity and the pursuit of anarchist social life is to me necessary because in that pursuit is both the only way it might remain a possibility as well as the only way it might become true. So for me, even though we don't know what will come of the work that we are doing, it's necessary still because that's the only way it might become true, I think, at least, especially for these kinds of radical, imaginative, liberatory politics. Okay, so to Black anarchism. Okay, Black anarchism, I want to try to choose my words carefully. I'm looking at my notes. I'm hoping that they're in a good order structurally. So Black anarchism marks this, at least for me, and I want to also stress the particularity or somewhat particularity of how I understand Black anarchism. There are other folks who understand this in slightly different ways. I want to make sure that I'm expressing how partial my view is on this. This is not the end all be all of Black anarchism. But Black anarchism for me marks this kind of qualitative shift relative to the things I just kind of talked about. So Black anarchism, at least to me, is not simply, though not exclusive of this, but not simply recovering all the lost and obscured Black people who declare themselves anarchists, nor is it kind of finger pointing at white supremacy or racial and racist oversights in classical historical anarchists. So while these moves have been made necessarily and justifiably so by people like Lorenzo Irvin, Ashanti Austin, who it seems like y'all will be bringing in, I think, next week, which is a marvelous, marvelous treat. And people like also the Black Rose Anarchist Federation, they make this kind of critique, and that is absolutely necessary and foundational for Black anarchism. My aim is in how Black anarchism ushers in a kind of fundamental qualitative shift that essentially, I would say, anarchizes anarchism, we might say. So it's not just about Black people who are anarchists or simply naming people as anarchists who are Black. That to me is is not quite the move that anarchism ends at, nor is it a finger pointing at classical anarchists for overlooking or forgetting about Black people and race. That's not the all of anarchism for me. What it is, I think, is what I call anarcho-Blackness. So anarcho-Blackness is the the kind of thread, the analysis that I use to think about Black anarchism. So someone like the historian Carl Levy focuses on the ism of anarchism, which define, I have his book somewhere back here. So when he focuses on the ism of of anarchism, that defines anarchism as a social movement that arose in a specific time and specific location, is identifiable as this social movement with members and all that kind of stuff. That's the ism of anarchism. For me, to focus on the anarcho, the kind of prefix of anarchism, that's to emphasize the kind of spirit of anarchic tendencies and modes of relation. Is a focus on world making sensibilities rather than a particular political organization or cadre of writing and movements. So anarcho-Blackness, which circulates within, but also against and excessive of the identifiable classical Black anarchism, it does not dwell on or dwell in kind of delineating criteria for a particular kind of Black anarchism as a movement, but it concerns the various modes and methods and thoughts and imaginaries that might be given to anarchic, unruled or unruly, non-coercive and coalitional affinities and textures for being with others. So that's how I want to try to understand Black anarchism, by emphasizing the anarcho in Blackness rather than the ism of Black anarchism. And actually, before we started all of this, one of the people here asked me, "Am I a an anarchist?" And I paused. After that, I said yes, but I paused because for me, it's less about possessing a certain kind of identity. I am an anarchist, which then implies so many things. For me, it's much more about how do I move in relation to others? How do I think about the kind of world I want to live in? That's the anarcho, the kind of spirit that drives how I want to understand Black anarchism. So the anarcho is that thing, that kind of I think spirit is always the word I want to try to come to. The anarcho is that kind of spirit that power and discipline respond to. So all those moments where normativity then kind of comes in to clamp things down, that unruliness, that way of moving outside of normative apparatus and the frameworks, that's what I want to try to designate as the anarcho. It's this kind of irreverence, I would say, toward disciplinary and toward discipline and curtailment, which we see in, for example, and I'll talk a little bit more about these examples in a bit, but we see that, for example, in Black gender non-normative people who are irreverent toward the gender binary and all the assumptions of its unchangeability, or we see in the ways that Black girls are marked as unruly and out of control and as uncooperative, which is to say anarchic. So this is what Saidiya Hartman called Black anarchy, or what William C. Anderson and Zoe Samudzi call the anarchism of Blackness. This is what I want to try to understand and cultivate as Black anarchism. But we can't stay there, of course. We absolutely cannot simply stay there. We also, I think at least, have to think about other vectors, namely, to me, gender. So thinking about gender in Black anarchism, and I'm going to back up just a little bit and talk about anarcha-feminism. So historically, those who are called anarcha-feminists have insisted, and anarcha-feminism kind of arose right around the time that anarchism arose. There was always this kind of mutual conversation happening. Those who are called anarcho-feminists have insisted on the gendered nature of capitalism and power, at least historically. So they saw that while even male and masculine identifying anarchists would concede that patriarchy is linked to class, there also needed to be this fundamental understanding that experiences under capitalism are differentiated and inflected by gender. So traditionally, anarchism relegated revolutionary and anarchic work to the public sphere as if the waged workplace was the only place work and labor was being done and from which people had to be liberated. So anarcho-feminists come in and insist that the family and the domestic sphere are also sites of valid anarchist conflict. So this is the kind of inception of anarcho-feminism and how it was, even in the moment of anarchism, quote unquote, proper, kind of emerging. Anarcho-feminism was trying to critique and expand the analysis there. So then the task of anarcho-feminism is not some misguided female empowerment type feminism, which would merely replace quote unquote men at the top 1% with quote unquote women. But anarcho-feminists want to, and this is a quote from the collection Queering Anarchism, that anarcho-feminism doesn't mean female corporate power or a woman president. It means no corporate power and no presidents. And that's a formulation that so often gets used in anarchism, one that I think is quite apt, I think. So that's anarcho-feminism, but of course there's an oversight here. We know the implicit assumption that all women occupy the unwaged domestic workplace, at least historically, fails to understand and consider the ways that Black women, for example, had an estranged relationship to this kind of a simplistic differentiation between workplace and home life, because Black women historically often worked in other people's homes, usually for white women. So I bring to this the Black feminism of people like those in the Combahee River Collective and what they write in their deeply famous Black feminist statement. If you have not read the Black feminist statement by the Combahee River Collective, it is essential reading, absolutely essential reading. So those folks do not call themselves anarchists, they call themselves socialists. But for me, I think one of the things that I'm curious about is how it seems like their socialism kind of pushes Karl Marx, and essentially via Black feminism, anarchizes Marx and other kinds of socialism. So if anarchists and anarchists have historically said this over and over, if anarchists hold that until all are free, then no one is free. We can note the express anarchism and kind of a Black feminist anarchism of the Combahee River Collective when they argue in that now famous sentence that if Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since Black women's freedoms would necessitate the destruction of all systems of oppression. So this makes an honest manifestation of anarchist politics have to necessarily grapple with and have as foundational Black feminism. All right. But then the last thing I want to say on gender and Black anarchism before I move to a close and get us thinking about what a kind of Black anarchist world might look like. But it's not, at least to me, not only that, but also a Black feminism that, as for me, a proper Black feminism is a Black feminism that is deeply tied to queerness and transness. So for this insight, I turn to, there's a group called the Horde Dyke Black Trans Feminist Network. That's their full name, all smushed together. Do some phenomenal work free out there. And they insist on what they call dynamiting the gender binary as a political practice. So for them, radical politics and the politics of anarchism and abolition specifically, radical politics requires that we explode the sex and gender binary, because the sex and gender binary are authoritative, coerced, and hierarchized impositions that, in anarchist fashion, ought to be decimated. And that's because how we are gendered is a product of how the state and its various apparatuses seek to discipline and produce, to coerce and hierarchize different kinds of desires and bodies and things like that. So those anarchistically concerned with gender, and historically they've been called anarchist sex radicals, they argue that gender as binaristically constructed rests at the heart of the state structure, at the heart of the state as such. So binary gender is regulated by law, institutions, religion, medicine, a whole bunch of other kind of social authorities. So a radical departure from the state then necessitates a radical departure from compulsory binary genders. So that's how we also want to think about bringing in conceptions of Black queerness and Black transis into this as well. So now then, to conclude my remark, before we get into a small kind of imaginative activity, how might what might a Black anarchic world look like? So at stake, in at least for me, and I want to always make sure that I'm noting the ways that my thinking here is partial. At stake in all of this for me, quite simply, is the actualization of the liberation that we so often talk about and seek to try to allow to emerge in the world. This world is and has long been on fire, and it's my assessment that what might extinguish that fire, or what might let the world continue to burn while cultivating another world that is predicated on the impossibility of flames engulfing us. All with that world, or how we get to that world, to me, is via something like Black anarchism. And what would a Black anarchist world look like? So perhaps it would look like, or it would be based on a kind of voluntary federation of radically decentralized, directly democratic participation in the creation of how we want to ethically relate to one another. And then in this sense, it would radically disperse power so much that power is no longer what power used to mean, but simply a kind of ethical relation to and obligation to others on the grounds that they exist. I was going to say sentient, but that also still kind of hierarchizes certain kinds of modes of thinking about and being aware of things. On the modes that something exists, that's how we then ground our ethical relation to others. So perhaps it looks something like that, or perhaps it also looks like a kind of overhaul of encountering others on coerced and taxonomized templates for livable life and one's options for one identity. It might look like a move toward radical self-determination, or various other kinds of things. We'll talk more about this in a second, but it can look like so many different kinds of things. It's not simply, I think, as often it's assumed that radical politics or politics proper needs to look like voting and policies and all those kind of things. It's not simply or even primarily about that, but it's about how do we relate to others on grounds that are more loving, more livable, more ethical, more generous. That's how I want to try to think about Black anarchism. And so, with all of this, too, I think, and I think it's also important to note this as well, with all of this comes the possibility, still, nonetheless, of harming others as well as ourselves. And I myself am no stranger to harm. I've done serious harm to others, and I've had serious harm done to me. These things impact us very deeply, very, very deeply, and perhaps even change us irrevocably. So it's not so much about being perfect in never harming anyone, because sometimes we have no idea what will be harmful to us and others. So it's not about that. It's about how we show up when harm is done, being ever vigilant about treading lightly so as not to transgress the things that we've all directly participated in agreeing upon as safe and loving for us. So how do we become accountable to the ways that we might impact other lives, committing to the always present possibility of transformation when a transgression happens? How might we establish networks and systems that consistently care for and offer avenues of care and affirmation? So these are the questions that animate kind of our redress of various kinds of harm that might. I'm skeptical of saying inevitably happen, but that might continue to happen even in the kind of Black anarchist world that we come to. So it's not about perfection or one-stop shop for redressing harm. It's about a kind of collective effort and a web of relationships that can tend to all the parts of us that need or desire being tended to. So as they say, no one is disposable. And that I try deeply, deeply to live by. No one and nothing is disposable. And that's what anarchism, what Black anarchism seeks, this kind of deepest belief in the non-disposability of anyone or anything that we live such that we promote the most life for us all. That's perhaps how we might think about what a Black anarchic world might look like, this kind of radical disposition toward non-disposability. So that's how I want to think about these things. And those will conclude my remarks. And then I want to move into a bit of an activity if we have, I think we have time. So I'm going to ask you all to get something to write with or on, or you can also just kind of sit with your own thoughts and think about this. So where this activity is coming from, I'm going to give us, I know we're kind of short on time, I'm going to give us maybe 5 or so minutes for this. So where this activity is coming from is so often we have so many critiques of the world in which we live. We can point out all of the bad things, the negative things, the things that are not working, and all those things are absolutely necessary. But I find that sometimes we don't quite know what it is that we do want. We don't quite know what it is that we do want the world to look like. So what I want us to do for about 5 minutes or so, and then we'll open it up for questions, comments, anything like that. But I want you all to spend about 5 minutes or so just sitting with thoughts, writing down thoughts of what do you want the world to look like based on your understanding of either anarchism or liberatory politics or abolition or what have you. What kind of world do you want to live in? What does that look like? What does that feel like to you? What would that mean with respect to things changing or things staying the same? How does the world look in your understanding of radical politics? I'm going to give us 5 minutes to do that, and then we'll open it up just for questions, sharing, things like that. How does that sound to folks? Write to yourself, sit with the question of what kind of world do you want to live in? I'll give us 5 minutes for that, and then we'll just open it up for sharing, questions, anything like that, all right? And then I want to invite folks to whatever extent you're comfortable or wish just to ask questions, share things that you were thinking in terms of what kind of world do you want to live in, questions you have for others, for me, anything like that. We got about 5 minutes, I think. Apologies for the short time, y'all. But again, as I said, feel absolutely free to email me. I can put my email in the chat. If y'all have questions about things, always feel free to email me. And it looks like we have a hand for someone who wishes to share. Balaji.
Hi, Dr.
Oh,
Bay. I'm a
hello.
real fan of your work.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And I regret when I was at Northwestern about 2 weeks ago, I didn't get a chance to come by and speak. But
Hmm.
not 2 weeks, I think I said 2 months. Anyway, I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you.
The largest question I have is anarchism is a great concept, but as you defined it in your lecture, it seems a bit fluid. And I think that is a good thing. But
Mhm,
for folks who are trained in academia, philosophy, as it is expressed, tends to be concrete.
mhm,
So, with that comment, what if you could give us a concrete definition? What does anarchism, Black anarchism in
mhm,
particular,
mhm.
demand differently from its other anarchist orientations?
Yeah, that's a great, great question. So I'll try to answer it quickly in two ways, and I can talk more extensively if you want later. So the first thing I'll say is Black anarchism specifically demands something different of, say, classical, quote unquote, classical anarchism, in that it is deeply attentive to what Saidiya Hartman might call the afterlife of slavery. So in what ways does the legacies of slavery and also the legacies of blackness, and what ways does that pervade, and also anti-blackness, in what ways does that pervade our world right now, and how do we account for that, like specifically? I think that's one thing that Black anarchism kind of differentiates itself from classical anarchism. I think another thing that we might say, to try to think more concretely, I think one of the things we might do is really, really consider like how we might actually literally restructure what our society looks like. So, for example, we have a bipartisan governmental system. Why? Like that kind of like at the level of the kind of government, what can we do differently with respect to that? Or another way that we might think about this is like, how can we say, for example, abolish prisons? Or how can we think about like what educational systems look like? Why do we have like grades, for example? Or why do we have like people who are impoverished having to go without lunch? Like those kinds of things, those kind of concrete things to me feel like actualizations of anarchism, precisely because they do not they concede to the non-disposability of people. So all these kinds of systems implicitly allow for people to be forgotten, disposed of. If anarchism, and Black anarchism specifically, is about non-disposability, how can we proliferate life chances? And there are a whole bunch of different ways that that can happen, because there are a whole bunch of different ways that people are refused life chances in educational systems, governmental systems, economic systems, housing, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we attack all of those things in ways that allow for more people to have access to life and livability and life chances, housing, et cetera, et cetera? So there's a whole bunch more specifics there, but I hope that just kind of gives us a quick sense, just a quick sense of the various kind of concrete thing that can happen. So we have like three more hands. We have Diva, Nia, and
Thank you.
Alula, I think. Diva first, Diva Williams.
Hi. Um, I wanted to be there today, but I didn't have the wellness for it. So I'm very grateful that we could also hybridize the process.
Mhm,
Anyway, more of a share than a question.
mhm,
I think in the time we had to think, what really radiated in my mind was that an anarchist world is a world that can be trusted.
mhm. Oh, I love that.
I
I love that
just
so much.
I feel that in order to abandon authority and hierarchy, we need to be able to trust in each other
Mhm.
to do what is right.
Yeah.
We need to trust in ourselves to do right by others. And we need to be able to trust in an education system that empowers everyone with the tools to do what needs to be done,
Mhm.
and then trust in a community to see that those needs are met.
Absolutely. I love that so, so much. This notion of trust, because I think there are other hands on. So very, very quickly, I think part of that is very much because we live in a world in which we are radically interdependent on one another. We literally cannot live without others to allow us or to help us or to support our life and livability. So we need to be able to trust because of that fundamental understanding of what it means to exist in a world with others. So thank you so much for that. Absolutely. And then Nia, please, you have your hand up.
Okay, can you hear me? We're having some technical
Mhm.
difficulties here. All right, excellent. So, and forgive me if this is a bit redundant or repetitive, but I'm interested in some history, and some contemporary. So you talked about anarchism as a response to theocracy.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious, are there moments in history, and I want to say kind of preceding theocracy, where anarchy was an actual reality?
Mhm.
And then the second part of that is, are there actual realities that you would point to today?
Mhm. So these are great questions. At least for me, I can't think of like pre-18th century moments in which anarchism as a kind of a system of a societal system existed in kind of full force. I have kind of flits and flickers of things. So what I'm thinking of immediately is maroon communities. So these are communities of either runaway and formerly enslaved people or people who are fleeing or escaping or fugitively eluding various kinds of systems of enslavement, and that I understand that broadly. These are communities that sustain themselves away from these kinds of enslaving kinds of systems or plantation systems. So those were not few and far between, but few and far between, I would still say. But that to me feels like a manifestation of a kind of anarchic society, I would say. And then today, what comes immediately to mind is not a good example because it ended very, very badly. But what comes immediately to mind was I don't know if folks remember the move kind of folks in Philadelphia. This is the mid 1980s, I believe, where this is a group of Black folks, kind of people who understood themselves as desiring to, insisting on living thoroughly outside of the various kinds of regulative frameworks of contemporary culture. And eventually, and there are documentaries and readings and books and all that kind of stuff on this, but eventually like their house was literally bombed because they posed such a threat to kind of existing order. So I guess this is to say that there is a cost, let's say, to the ways that we might try to express radical politics, that we might try to express anarchist politics in the world. The world that we exist in does not want that. And so it will respond in various kinds of harmful, violent ways as it always has. And so what then do we do when we are encountered with those kind of things? So those are two examples that come immediately to mind. There are many, many others, but it's hard to say, here's this place, this moment in history where this actually happened and arose and was a thing, because the world in which we live so often, in order to maintain itself, needs to eradicate these movements or these places, these societies. So it's hard to find these places that have existed in a sustained kind of way because the kind of apparatuses we find ourselves within so often try to eradicate those things. So on the other hand, Alula.
And actually, sorry, Marquis.
Oh, are we out of time?
Yeah, we are at time,
Oh,
but here's what I like to do really quickly. So always a sign of a hit when we go over. So thank you so much, Marquis.
Thank y'all.
Definitely all of us here as enthusiastic as you are about the topic and about learning. What I'm gonna ask is if Alula, Noah, and Louise, if you could just say your question so we can get it on the record, but Marquis, you just won't be able to answer it live, but we can at least hear the questions. And actually, okay, Louise put her hand down. So Alula and Noah, if you could just, yeah, just really quickly, just say what your question is, and also feel free to drop it in the chat.
That's perfect. Peace, Marquis. Just want to say thank you for your time. My question is, I'm wondering how you understand Black anarchism as it may exist in physical space. So I'm wondering if there are sort of scales at which you're envisioning this politics and this theory existing. And then also wondering how can anarchy live in cities, especially given the context you just gave with Move Philly and sort of, yeah, cities being oppositional to such a way of life. But, yeah.
Awesome question. Thank you for that.
Yes, excellent question, Alula, that we cannot get the answer to right now. Well done, well done. All right, Noah, how about you?
Mine, can you all hear me? Okay. Mine was less of a question and more just a thought that was prompted by your original question about what world I'd want to live in. And I also just want to say, I love your writing so much. Black Transhumanism changed my entire life. It's like my most worn book on my bookshelf.
Oh, thank you.
But I wrote just a little something. I said, I want to live in a world that is plenum, as Denise Ferreira da Silva has written, a world that is not predicated on a separation of beings, a parsing of souls, a splicing of the self. I want to live in a vibrantly artistic, musically creative space grounded in, or maybe ungrounded in, a current of love that does not make oneself beholden to the idea of themselves as a delineated being. I want to love, fuck, work, create, write, play, sleep, doze, eat, and drink in the beautiful beyond, unbounded, surrounded, in unrestrained breath. Yeah, that was
Thank you. I think that's a lovely way to end this. Thank you all so much.